Okay, so hey, what's up everybody? My name is Brenton. I'm a freelance filmmaker and DP, and today we're talking about this, I almost said relic, this workhorse of a camera. That's what this is a workhorse. This is the camera that won't die. You know? Turn it on. This guy, you can see the buttons light up. There we go. This is the C300 Mark II. So today in the video, we're gonna be talking about C300 Mark II. If you should be looking at this camera, we're gonna be talking about why I bought such an old camera. The camera was released a good while ago now. I believe it was 2016? No, I think it was 2015. I'm gonna look this up again. This camera does a couple things really, really well. And it has several caveats and cons, one of which is that it is only PL mount for this particular model, which kind of negates some of the features that Canon released with this camera. One of which was their face tracking for dual pixel autofocus. Which was pretty revolutionary when it came out. It was on the 70D and then it came out for this guy. And I would say the image quality is its greatest pro. This camera still holds up to pretty much any sub $5,000 camera. It's not till you jump up to something like an FX6 or even a C300 Mark III where you really start to get a better image than this camera produces. When this camera came out, it competed with the Sony FS7, the Mark I. And at the time, that camera was about $8,000, give or take. This camera kind of competed with it silently at $16,000 MSRP, which was a big chunk of change. So yeah, this camera heavily competed with the FS7 as far as image quality. And in many ways, this camera really exceeded the FS7, and especially in dynamic range. The shadows are much cleaner on this camera than that camera. As soon as you jump into the world of high frame rates, this camera does not have it. This camera tops out at 30 frames a second in 4K, which by today's standards is not a lot. You have cameras that can easily hit. The C70 can do 4K to 120 frames a second, and with better dynamic range than this camera. So by today's standards, this camera is lacking a lot. But what I do like about this camera are the I/O. I love having a full set of I/O. It's got 2 SDI outs, HDMI. It's got a monitor cable for this monitor. It's got timecode, gen lock. So you really get a full suite of I/O with this camera, which is really nice. Okay, so why did I buy such an old camera? Well, the easy answer is because it was cheap. I was looking at getting a second camera for my C300 Mark III. I do a lot of corporate, a lot of music video style shoots, and I needed a B camera for the Mark III, but I didn't want to get a C70 because the C70 is still $5,500. So I started looking at the R5C that came out, and that's about $4,500, so saving $1,000 there, and you get a full frame, which is kind of a nice plus, and I get to use some more lenses, but $4,500, it's still a lot of money. So I was kind of scouring ShareGrid, which if you don't know what it is, it's a really cool kind of community of people that sell their gear and rent their gear out. It's a peer-to-peer system. I bought this camera from a guy in New York who was upgrading to a different camera system, and he was selling this for $2,000. I thought it was a scam when I saw it because these cameras still regularly go for $4,000, even $5,000. Even right now, today, as I'm filming this video, they sell this camera for $7,500 on B&H, which you should not be buying new. But Canon still supports this camera. It's still part of their, pro services. They haven't really end of life this camera yet, which is really interesting. Most companies will move on from their camera system and stop selling their old one. Side note, I love DSLR video shooters videos on his older cameras like the Sony F3 and the Red 1, because those are still fantastic cameras. And the Red 1 competes with the image quality of this camera. Okay, funny fact about this camera is still Netflix approved, and that's because it records in 10-bit DCI, sorry, it's 4K DCI, and it's an all-I codec, as well as either Timecode or Genlock. I think it's Timecode. So 5, Timecode are some of the main reasons that this camera is still Netflix approved. If I was funding my own project and Netflix was not giving me any money, I would shoot with this camera. But if Netflix was giving me money to produce a project, I probably wouldn't shoot on this camera because I would have access to just renting any other camera that is a little bit nicer. It doesn't really matter if your camera is Netflix approved, but it is good that Netflix sees that this camera has strong enough specs and image quality to still be on their list. One of the other main reasons I bought this camera was the log profiles it offers. It offers both Canon Log 3 and Canon Log 2, which is what I typically shoot my videos in on the Mark III over here. And a lot of Canon's current lower end cameras don't actually offer Canon Log 2, such as the R5C. I don't know why they don't have it on there. The camera does have a good amount of dynamic range, but I think it's just shy of kind of that 15 stop mark that this camera kind of entrepreneur. This camera had a lot of dynamic range for when it came out. But still, I prefer Canon Log 2 just to eke out just like a half a stop more in the shadows. Even if it's a little bit noisy, I use a denoiser in Resolve and it looks really good after that. So that is probably the biggest driving factor to me purchasing this camera over a lot of other competitors for the price is that Canon log curve of Canon Log 2, as well as the Canon color space with the Canon Cinema Gamut, matching the Mark III pretty well in most scenarios. Let me check my false color here. Speaking of false color, this camera doesn't have it. I've been spoiled with false color. I love false color on the Mark III. I use an Atomos Shogun to do false color on this camera, and it works great. I wish it was built in, but those are some of the little creature comforts that you have to sacrifice with buying an older camera sometimes, is that they don't have all the latest features. Okay, so in this price point, if you need an A camera, this camera might not be the best camera for you. The PL version does not have autofocus. It costs about $2,300 to swap this to an EF mount because you have to send it into Canon, I learned. So I learned that after I purchased the camera, which was, hindsight. But if you get an EF version of this camera, you can actually manually swap out the EF mount to a PL mount. The dynamic range for the money is better than a Pocket 6K Pro, but the dynamic range isn't necessarily better than something like an FX3. For me, this camera made a lot of sense because of my current involvement in the Canon ecosystem, and I don't want to switch my whole workflow just yet. So I'm not going to go to Sony, and I'm not going to go to Red right now because there's too many drawbacks for me switching systems. So for me, this camera made a lot of sense. As a company, I really appreciate Canon, and their kind of the ease of use and the function of the camera is a very high priority for Canon. A lot of camera companies such as Red don't have that mentality. It's image over usability. And for a lot of people, image quality isn't actually the highest on their list, and it's usability. Does the camera do well in low light? Does it have high frame rates? And I really like this camera because it still fits in Canon's ecosystem really well with my other camera. If you're looking at something like a Canon C200, this camera still does look a little bit better, I noticed. Like the codecs are a little more flexible, and I don't have to shoot RAW, which is inherently a little noisier. So to wrap up this video, the Canon C300 Mark II is a pretty solid workhorse still. I think it's definitely aged pretty well, and I think if you're in the market for a Canon camera with a decent amount of dynamic range still, you should definitely look at picking one of these up in the EF mount, unless you like PL, I don't know. But yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to see me make some more content. See you in the next one. Bye.